Brought to you by the Alabama Aquarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the Sea Lab, and today we are going to be chatting with Dr. Jeff Krause, who is a scientist here at the lab, and he is going to chat with us about a research project that he has conducted over the past year following Hurricane Ida and examining the impacts of Hurricane Ida on offshore environments in the Gulf of Mexico. So with that, I am going to let Dr. Krause tell you a little bit about it.
Hey, thank you, Mendel. What we are doing is actually called Extreme Silica, and that's kind of what I study. I study silica. Silica is an element in the earth. You might know silica by those little packets that get sent with anything that you ship, the silica gel, but we study organisms that use silica to make shells of glass. Now, silica is also found in sediment. Sand is made of quartz, that's a type of silica. Clay is a type of silica, so silica is pretty much everywhere. And one of the reasons we wanted to understand what the silica cycle is because it has a lot of relevance to how Earth systems function. And so after the hurricane, this was the hurricane that hit in August of 2021. That was Hurricane Ida. And Hurricane Ida was a Category 4 hurricane. And where it struck about a week earlier. And so we had an opportunity to go back and see how the hurricane stirred up the water, how it altered the sediments, and we could track how they changed over time. And so some of the things that we look for in sediments, how are we doing? We're doing good. Some of the things we look for in sediments is how do sediments kind of process materials that come from the water. Some of the ways they do that is organisms can break down organic matter. And when they do that, and when they eat bacteria, worms, everything in the sediments, they actually change the chemistry of the sediments. And when they change that chemistry, it changes how will basically be preserved. And so that's one of the reasons we were looking at it. And the reason that it's important is because some of the byproducts of those reactions are carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, was it?
Coke's over here.
Yeah, no worries. And carbon dioxide gas. So as those materials get processed, the carbon dioxide can outgas to the water, and then it can interact with the atmosphere. So this is somewhat cerebral, but it's okay. It's something that we have spent a lot of time looking at. And the Mississippi River plume and the coastal Louisiana shelf is a really important region, globally connected. As I was saying, this region of the Louisiana shelf is really important for this type of kind of sediment processes. So what we ended up doing is we ended up going back to sediments, and we went back 4 different times on this research vessel. This is called the research vessel, and this is our science party, including Mendel, on a trip that we had just a couple weeks ago. And when we go out, which is a bit of a misnomer because there's only a couple of bathrooms for us to share, and this is actually one of them. You can see this lovely looking bathroom, and this wonderful, everybody will eat their meals and hang out. You guys can see that's not exceptionally large.
Here's the bathroom right here.
That's the bathroom. And then these are, and so what we do is we want to capture the sediment, and we want to understand how processes in the sediments change over time. So how do you think we need to sample sediment? Do we send a graduate student down to the bar? No, we don't do that. We're much more advanced now. We have so this instrument here, it's called a multi-core system, and it goes with tubes, and they're open as we release them. The tubes plunge into the sediment, and then we get a core. So this is a multi-core tube, and it's all spring-loaded. There's no electrical parts on it. And when it is in position, this is attached to basically a bunch of levers. And when it goes down and it punches into the sediment, it does this. And then when you bring it back up, the foot scoops under. and create suction, so we can bring this up back to the surface and actually sample it or play with it.
And hopefully it's full of mud.
See, it's get mud up to here. Sometimes we'll get mud all the way up to this, and sometimes we don't really hit much at all. If it's really sandy, we don't get a lot of sediment. And so sometimes, yeah, so this is a pretty muddy core. You can see this mud level would be to the equivalent range of about in here on the core tube. Now, a core, and this isn't very easy to work with. So we have to adjust it, and we have to bring it to something. So basically, we bring it to this, what we call an extruder. And so what we need to do is we need to take the core tube off, and then we need to get it onto the extruder.
So pretend this is full of mud.
And this is full of mud. Yeah, and then what we can do is we can take off this frame. And now,
we did it once with at every site, but there were 8 tubes on the multi-core.
Any of these different extruders, and so once we get the sediment near the top, and we can push it down by set intervals.
So the mud would come up at the surface, so it would be extruded up at the surface, and so you can slice that off and take 2 centimeter or 5 centimeter samples out of this tube, and the profile has been preserved. So this actually punches down into the mud, so you are preserving that kind of layering.
Yeah, and so when you scrape it clean, the top, and then we extrude it up. It's kind of like when you turn your chapstick and you just kind of pop it out. And instead of just rubbing it on your lips, imagine you take a little knife and you just cut it off and you have this little pancake worth of sediment on there. So this is how we're able to take sediment cores and actually look down the layers and see what's actually happening in the sediments. And just because things are sitting on top of one another doesn't mean that they're not connected to the surface. So organisms will move through the sediments, especially at the surface, and that process, what it does is it exchanges water, because the water deep in the sediments is very old and it hasn't seen the water column a lot. And what that does is that creates a lot of kind of chemical exchanges, we like to call it. So you can move material from the sediments into the water and vice versa. And so one of the things that we saw with the storm is that the storm, because it mixed the water so significantly, the storm oxygenated, means it put oxygen into the surface sediments to depths that normally oxygen wouldn't be. So typically, how much, I'm gonna ask you a question. How deep do you think oxygen would go in sediments to where it's just completely gone, where nobody can breathe?
To the bottom.
To the bottom? That is a really good guess, but it's not that deep. In fact, most of the time, oxygen maybe only penetrates this much into the surface sediments, less than a centimeter. And so sometimes what happens is when the water gets mixed up, you can actually start putting oxygen deeper into the sediments, and that helps animals, worms, things that like to breathe, things like us, will actually be able to consume the organic matter in there because of these injections of oxygen.
So one thing I always like to clear up, because I think this may be a source of confusion for people, is that those animals that live in water, that breathe with gills, they breathe oxygen. So they breathe oxygen that is dissolved into the water, not part of the water molecule. They're not breaking apart the H2O, but there is oxygen gas, the same O2 oxygen gas that we breathe, that our lungs take out of the air, their gills take out of, it's dissolved in the water. And so they need oxygen to survive. So if they are little burrowing animals like worms and things, clams, you know, the amount of oxygen, or that zone down into the mud that has oxygen in it, is going to determine how deep those animals can survive burying themselves.
So if you're a pretty big animal, if you're a good digger, you can dig yourself a burrow, and then you can connect it to the surface, which is why sometimes when you walk on sand or mud, you might see holes or pores. That might be an organism that's burrowed down, and they leave this open, basically so the water can exchange, so effectively they can breathe with the oxygen in there. Otherwise, they can consume all, they would suffocate. So that action, that biological response, that changes how things are processed in the sediments. And those are the types of processes we are looking for, seeing what a hurricane effect was. While my specific expertise is down kind of on the food web and the microbe level, these processes kind of are similar in terms of larger organisms as well. So we slice through this and we make our profile, but there's other ways you can sample sediments. If you want to go deeper in the sediments, you might need a longer core tube. It looks kind of like a torpedo, but this is what we call a gravity core. And so at the other end of this, we're basically screwing in a massive weight, something that might be 100 or 200 kilos. So anyone know how many pounds 100 or 200 kilos is? How many pounds? So how much does 100 kilos weigh? Do you know? You have any guesses? Yeah, so you're pretty good. Yeah. So 100 to 200 kilos is about 200 to 400 pounds. We put that on, we puncture it into the sediment, and then as we bring it back up, this little catch, which kind of looks like a juicer, would hold the sediment in from falling out, and then we can put it to a different type of extruder, and then we can section and we can get layers of the sediment to see how things have changed over time, or how storm activity is changing processes in maybe the upper 10, 20 centimeters of sediment. So let's say, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I brought this, we didn't use it, but just for comparison with these cores, this thing is called a bucket dredge, and the way this would be used would, it would just be drawing some bottom sediment into it. And so you can see that as a comparison, this would not preserve any kind of layers in the sediment. So, the difference between this cores that Dr. Krause has been showing you means that you can see that layering. So you can see the oxygenated area and where the living things are, the worms and the clams and things. Where with this, it's more of a kind of a rough sample.
Like, what are the sediments here versus the sediments maybe north of in the ocean? Those types of comparisons would probably be okay. Now, in our local environment, sedimentation near the Mississippi River plume is exceptional. And how much do you think, kids? Do you have any guesses? Like in distance, how much do you think might accumulate every year in sediments near the Mississippi River?
I don't.
Any guesses? Should you show me with your hands? Would it be like this much?
Mississippi is this.
Maybe? Okay. In real world, it's about this much per year, which in most of the ocean doesn't sound like a lot, but this is exceptional because in most of the places of the ocean, it's at millimeter per year, which is maybe 20 times lower or even lower, especially in the deep sea. So we accumulate a lot of sediment layers in this environment, which allows us to basically go through these layers with better precision because we can better hone in on specific times.
Can you explain the difference in the rate of, you just explained the rate of sedimentation, but where that sedimentation is coming from and why it's dramatically different in the open ocean
Absolutely.
Versus at the Mississippi plume?
So a lot of the sediments that are settling in the ocean, a lot of them have originally come from the land. So in places like the Mississippi River plume, or you could say also Mobile Bay, you have a lot of sediment that's being discharged. It's being pushed into the system. And the denser sediments, the heavier stuff is going to fall out first. So think sands. But clays will travel further. And so when you get to the open ocean, clays will finally settle there because the ocean's so large. And in addition to those types of sediments, you also have organisms that will settle down to the deep. Occasionally you get a whale, but that's a pretty big rare particle in the ocean. Most of the particles in the ocean are planktonic that are sinking. They're tiny, they're microscopic, and they settle slowly. So the deeper the water, typically the less particles that you have that will sink there. But since we're closer to shore, we got a lot of sediment. And you can typically see this. You can see these sediment plumes when you're driving a boat in Mobile Bay, and you notice that there's this really stark transition from this turbid, almost brown water to this kind of more blue-green water. And sometimes the tide will mark where that line is, and that's where basically the salt water and the fresh water are pushing together. But you can see all that particle loading in the river water. So other ways we can grab sediment is we can do something similar to the bucket, where we can just make a little grab. This you send down. Let me just set over this, and it just is a scissor grab. Bring it back up and seals everything up, and then you can subsample it. Much like the bell precision, it just gives you a layer at the top. Okay, so that's how we sample the ways we sample the sediments in my lab. But sometimes we want to know a little something about the water, and so we've all down to the bottom. That's really dangerous. So what do we need to do instead? How do you think we can get water from the bottom of the sea to look at the water?
Just lower a bucket?
Can you lower a bucket?
Like a bucket, George?
A little metal bucket and grab some water.
So would you if you put a metal bucket down there, would you know that it was only the water from the very bottom that you got? Or when you pulled it up, do you think the water would mix and you get water?
If you were going floating on a floaty, I would bring a bucket with you.
Okay, a bucket.
So if you wanted to take your water sample, if you were interested in what was going on in the water right at the surface, that would work. But what if you want to get water from the bottom and see how it might be different?
Or here's a guess. What if you want to get water from a mile deep?
I don't have any guesses.
That's a tough instruments down to get that.
Well, I mean, that's a good point. Somebody had to puzzle over that
Exactly.
and figure out how that could be done. And so this is kind of a sample of some different sampling equipment some technology that people have come up with for collecting samples out of the ocean.
So one of the ways that they figured out is you can send spring-loaded or tension-loaded bottles down when they're open, and then the water flows in, and then when you bring it back up, and so it's open on both ends. You can see right through it. This can be a metal spring. In this case, this is surgical tubing. And then when you send it down, you want to close the vent. So, and then you also have a spigot, which you can close. You close it by pulling it. It's kind of counterintuitive. And then it goes down open, and then when we want to, we can attach it to some sort of a trigger. And then the bottles will close themselves, sealed, and as you bring it up, preserved water sample from the depth that you actually want to work with it. The challenge with this is making sure they don't leak, but we've figured that one out. And the ground open. Why do you think that is? Why would you?
It's still closed to get water. If the bottles are closed, it wouldn't get it.
As if the bottles are closed, what happens when you go down deep? The water pressure increases. If you keep them closed, we send them down to such depths that it would crack the bottles. The air pressure would crack them. So down deep in the ocean, we can have maybe 400 times more pressure than we feel right now. And so it would be really bad. Our trigger, this is the trigger that you would use. And when you have set to the trigger, actually I can show. You can see that so you can do this mechanically with maybe a some sort of a weight that goes down on the line, or you can do this with what we call a rosette, which is just a trigger mechanism that's connected with a electronic cable, and that allows you to basically subsample. So for what we do. This is 10 liters, and on the they can hold 24 of these. And so we can send them down and we can sample water at 24 specific depths in the water column. And then what we do with the water involves processing, so we can look for what types of nutrients are in the water. We can filter it to see what types of particulates are in the water. Lots of different things. It's just based on your research or your imagination.
So this is one of the rosettes that holds several of those bottles. And this one is triggered with a mechanical cable, so it can be programmed to close different bottles at different depths. So you can actually get, you could do a surface sample, you could do one at every 10 meters, you could do one at the bottom.
So in this particular rosette, what we ended up doing is we could actually watch this in real time. We have sensors telling us things like temperature, how salty the water is, how much oxygen is in the water. And we have all these sensors, and we can see how the waters are layered, and then we can make a decision about where we want the water in real time. And so as Mendel mentioned, a lot of what we did, because we were working with sediments, we sampled a lot of water very near the bottom, about maybe a meter above the bottom. And then we also sampled water at the surface. And again, the types of things we're looking at is we want to understand the particles that came from the water, and we want to sample the water to look at those particles as well.
So what did you learn from the series of research cruises that you did since Ida?
So one of the things I think is surprising is we have some changes that we observed in response to the hurricane, but I was expecting bigger changes. So we expected that a storm like Ida would have eroded up to 15 centimeters, so maybe about that much of the sediment bed, even in water feet deep. It doesn't look like we saw that. Now, if they did, things stabilized pretty quickly. So we went back out a couple months after Ida, mainly because of the logistics of getting back there. Ida really left a pretty strong trail of destruction, and there was a lot people lost homes, people lost livelihoods, so getting back out was a challenge. But the other things that we're seeing is that surprisingly, there's a lot more seasonality in the sediments than we anticipated. So these are data that we're working up right now, but things, some people have thought done and it just stops. But one of the things that this study is showing us is that there are lots of changes happening, even maybe this far away from the surface where there's no interaction with the water. And those are things that are surprising, and that we're following up on that. And so as we go through, we're going to learn a lot more about the system than just what the response was to the hurricane.
So once again, the dates were December, March, June, and August year following Hurricane Ida, which came ashore in coastal Louisiana last August. And so, when a scientist is proposing a research question, and they may have some initial ideas, some sort of educated guesses, some hypotheses about what they are going to find, they will go and collect evidence, and then they will consider, whether that evidence supports their hypothesis or not. And so Dr. Krause is explaining to us that they didn't necessarily see the kinds of impacts from Ida that they expected to, maybe, or that they thought they might. And he suggested some possible reasons. But then they may learn some things that they didn't expect to learn. So some things that they didn't even initially consider, like the seasonal variation, the seasonal changes at the bottom in these sites that they weren't necessarily expecting to see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you have to get a boat that's seaworthy enough to get to these deep waters. Then you have to have the right equipment to deploy that thing, that multi-core that we showed the picture of. It weighs if not when you're in really deep water. I have a colleague of mine who used a similar system north of Antarctica, and the water depth there is about 4,000 meters, and so it takes 2 or 3 hours just to send it down and back up. And if it misfires, you got to do it all again on research vessels that are very costly. So you could potentially burn 6 hours and not really have anything to show for it. We can set it down only about 300 feet and get something pretty quickly. And if we don't, if it fails, we can make adjustments on the deck and we can get it. So we proposed to leave with, and we came back with what we said we did. But it's much more risky sometimes when you go into these deeper waters where you're already 6 or 7 and all of a sudden your equipment's not working, and you can't run out to the store to get it because. So we're fortunate.
I think it kind of surprises some people to realize what questions are still, left to answer. How much we don't know. But that's part of the reason, because it's very difficult to sample the bottom of the ocean, and it's expensive and time consuming. And then once these samples are acquired, then they have to be analyzed. And so we humans have done a lot of sampling of the ocean and of the bottom of the ocean, but we still have an awful lot to learn.
Yeah, and the other issue too is we have 4 trips, 2 to 3 days apiece, and on those 4 trips we will collect enough samples. It will take us probably 3 or 4 years to analyze everything. There's certain things that we have to analyze quickly because our funding will run out, but then beyond that, to be, you got to look at data for a while, ask questions of it, reassess your assumptions, and that's a process that takes time, and a lot of times it fails, and then you have to go back and figure out what went wrong, and then you got to redo it. And so the process takes a lot longer than, regrettably, just the 8 days. One of my PhD students will be working with them, and he's starting his 3rd year. He's going to be analyzing these samples on an instrument, and even if he gets these samples analyzed, it might take him 6 months to analyze them all, but it will take him maybe another year and a half to understand what the samples are telling us, what the data are telling us. And so, yeah, the process is pretty long. But as Mendel was saying, we are fortunate. There's a mechanism of funding through the National Science Foundation to fund research after major events. So after Hurricane Harvey, faculty who went out and were able to sample the water of Texas because things had changed so much. We were fortunate to get a funding mechanism after Hurricane Ida. This also happens for other types of events, whether it be volcanic events or whether it be West. We call these rapid proposals. They can typically get funded within weeks. Normal funding cycles at National Science Foundation take 6 months to go through a process. And so when you have, usually they're small, out and grab the samples while you still can, and then process a critical amount, and then that gets you data to write a bigger project down the road, which can help you gain even more understanding about the questions that you might have in a specific system.
I'll just comment on one of Jeff's points, that sometimes you send that sampling equipment down to the bottom and you have like an equipment malfunction, and like the spring loaded core may not trip for some reason, and so you don't get that scoop. It comes up empty. So I've been fortunate enough to go out on 2 of these cruises with Dr. Krause. And I always like to capture that moment. I do photos and videos. I always like to capture that moment when the multi-core first breaks, see whether you actually got mud, and people cheer.
Yes.
If there's mud in the cores.
Yeah, and then when we went out the first time in December, it went down. Our water depth was about 150 feet, so 50 meters. It came back up, nothing. They didn't trip. Send them down again, nothing. Send them down again, nothing. So we had to start taking apart the instrument on the back of the deck in the sea state to try to figure out what was going on. And it came down to small springs. Not weight is what sets the whole thing off. It is kind of a really elegant design because you want to use as few electronics in salt water as possible. Explosive and conductive, and it does bad things to electronics. So these, as you see, based on mechanics. It's not based on electronics, which means that even in a small boat without a power source, you can still do this type of research. Now, you can't do it at the scale of a 2,000-pound instrument, but you can collect if you have the right equipment.
And we're talking about, you know, our modern technology, but again, as Dr. Krause is pointing out, a lot of it is mechanical rather than electronic. But, you know, humans have been sampling the ocean for hundreds of years. So we've been, you know, sending buckets and nets down into the ocean to pull things out and examine them for a long time. Do you guys have any questions?
I'm curious about the bell. When it's coming back up from the sediment, how does it not wash as it's coming
That's a great question.
The question was, as this bell is coming up, how does the sediment stay in? Or it does get washed out a little bit, which is another problem with this. If you need really, you know, if you need to know that you got sediment from, let's say, this layer, you're not going to get that with an instrument like this. But if you just need sediment from this area and you don't care how mixed it gets, you're probably in pretty good shape. And it's much more simple to use than, you know, something like these multi-core systems.
It can also depend on what kind of sediment you're pulling up.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes, you know, we might be in sandy bottom or muddy bottom, or a, you know, even finer, a clay bottom, or like a bottom that has a lot of shell in it. So it can also, how well your sample will stay in a bucket dredge like this can also be related to the kind of sediment that's being pulled up.
If it's really clay, lots of clay, it will stick. It will stick wonderfully, and just makes it very heavy. all that sediment, all that water it's holding. So
I think that also people kind of underestimate the importance of these processes to themselves. So a lot of times as scientists, you know, we're really curious about what's going on, and sometimes we will find how that is, you know, relevant to people, you know, and sometimes it's more about understanding what's going on in this ecosystem, you know, without regard to the impacts to humans. But I think a lot of times people are curious about how that's connected to humans.
the processes in the sediments are really important. So, you know, in urban areas we have sewage treatment plants to handle waste. Well, that's in sediments where you can remove nitrogen out of systems. And so there's a lot of different things that occur in the sediments to help, you know, kind of systems purify or rebalance sediment. Sounds like a cannon just went off.
That was a cannon at the fort.
But yeah, did a lot of this type of functionality at industrial scale to help us. And these are types of things that happen naturally in sediment environments.
You guys have any other questions?
Can you use a pulley to lift it up so it won't be heavy?
Absolutely.
And in fact, it's a must. And sometimes we'll use winches and cranes because the instruments, when they're fully loaded, are too heavy to work safely with. So we want to bring them up safely, so we'll use a crane to do that. And then we'll also use a crane to reposition onto the boat so we don't have to lift it up when the boat's moving. Because I don't know if you've ever been on a boat, but when you're trying to work and you're doing this, it's a challenge.
Somebody could get knocked off the boat if they were trying to lift this. So that's an important reason to use those cranes and the pulleys and winches. And also a lot of these are spring loaded because they're designed to kind of jab into the bottom and then trigger, and so they have to trigger with a lot of force to go through that sediment. And so you have to be very careful not to to trip those and hurt yourself. Well, that's another reason to use machines to lift them and move them around. That is an excellent question about how we use machines to help us mechanically.
We could also send machines to the deepest part of the ocean and not risk somebody getting hurt. The second you send a human down to the bottom of the ocean, it's a much more dangerous endeavor. So if we can, we would prefer to send machines or instruments down because they can be replaced. And that's one of the things we operate by. We want to make sure that we're being safe and we can do science another day.
You guys have any other questions? You all are welcome to take a closer look at this equipment. Think that we don't have anything currently spring loaded.
Yep, no, everything's
you guys are welcome
been,
to come up and check it out. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next time.